Good morning, everyone. My name is Florent Hannard. I'm a postdoc researcher at the Catholic University of Louvain-la-Neuve in Belgium. And today I'm going to talk about the first steps because, as you will see, this is only the beginning of the story. First steps in the development of dense and metallic architectural materials produced by additive manufacturing. So before jumping to the introduction, I want to say that a lot of the results have been obtained in collaboration with Fiona Kren, who is a master student from Polytech Nantes who is currently doing an internship in our lab. Okay, so the outline of my talk today is quite classical. First, I'm going to start with an introduction, context and motivation, and I think this is quite important because this work is not very classical. We're trying to go in a new direction with additive manufacturing, I think. And then I will explain how we have been trying to generate architectural metallic materials by engineering the defects associated to the LPBF process. And then I will show you some results about the microstructural characterization and also the first mechanical results that we have. And finally, I will conclude and give you a few words about the future work. So first of all, what are architectural materials? Well, these are composite materials, but with a very precise organization of the two materials, or two phases, for example. And architectural materials are actually quite classically observed in nature. So for example, if you look at nature, you would see that this is actually showing a brick and mortar architectures. So you see that the nacre is made of these little bricks, a few microns length. These bricks are actually made of aragonite, which is which is very rigid, but also it's some kind of ceramic, but it's also very brittle. And in between these bricks, there is, for example, the nacre protein, which is basically can be seen as a polymer, which is relatively weak, but at the same time it's quite ductile. And the thing is that if you look at the fractal toughness of these two constituents, it is relatively low. However, by combining these two constituents in this very beautiful architecture, nacre and natural evolution has found a solution to generate nacre, which is very high in toughness when compared to the base constituent. And this is due to different toughening mechanisms which are active in the material. So to put it simply, for example, the bricks are sliding on each other, increasing the size of the process zone, dissipating energy, and this is why you have such a remarkable toughness amplification. And this is a good inspiration to try to build engineering architectural materials. So what we are trying to do is to generate architectures within metallic materials. That means that from a processing point of view, we really need like a localized control of the material properties. And this is obviously why additive manufacturing is a very good candidate. So what we want to do is being able to introduce, for example, interfaces within the materials, and these interfaces have a low yield stress but a high ductility. And at the same time, we want to be able to generate cells in between these interfaces which have a high yield stress but which would be typically associated with a lower ductility. And by combining these two phases, or you can see it as materials, we will probably be able to introduce toughening mechanisms within the material, such as crack deflection, for example. And that means that the toughness and the resistance curve of the architectural materials will be improved compared to the base constituent. So that means that we would be able to generate material with a high toughness and a high defect tolerant properties, and that is critical to enhance the reliability of the additive manufacturing process, which is still a critical point in many engineering applications. And finally, I want to insist on 2 points. First is that the architectures that we are trying to introduce in the materials is at the mesoscale, typically of a few millimeter, because we want to be larger than the microstructures in such a way that we have a very good control of the architecture, but at the same time we want to be much smaller than the component that we want to produce, in such a way that we do not just optimize one tensile test, for example, but we really design new printing strategies that allow to generate high toughness components. And finally, I will most likely not keep on saying the word dense, but here I want to insist on the fact that these architectures, they contain really a limited percentage of porosity, typically a few percent, and this is really different compared to what is usually called architect materials, which means usually lattice structures, which are really like a high porosity, low density materials. So now I'm going to explain how we have been trying to generate these architectures, not by using, for example, 2 different materials, but by trying to control and engineer the defects associated with laser powder bed fusion additive manufacturing. And all of the results that I'm going to show in the presentation have been obtained on a DMP 100 3D printing system from 3D Systems. So there are different defects and thus different strategies that we can use in order to introduce like variability of material properties within the 3D printing process. The first and most classical one are voids and microcracks, and these defects can be used because the voids, for example, introduce locally a softening effect, and that means that we can create interfaces with lower yield stress as compared to the matrix. Another strategy which is rather well known but has not been discussed in the context of architectures is to use like a Highland scan strategy, for example, and this is well known to generate like a bimodal distribution of grain. And also 2 strategies which are more related to titanium alloys is the in situ decomposition of martensite that could be used locally to create an architectures, and also in situ alloying. So in this case, in titanium molybdenum alloy, for example, and by using different laser process parameter, you can or not introduce a lot of molybdenum in the matrix, and this allows you to create interfaces with a much lower hardness compared to the matrix. Alright, so the advantage of these strategies is mainly that the microstructure is generated in situ, meaning that you do not need any post-printing treatments to generate these architectures. There is no need for multiple powder feedstock control, because in this case we use a single material. We are not trying to use different multiple powder feedstocks, and also that means that you create a reliable and reproducible process, since by definition you are introducing defects that you control quite precisely. We are currently working on all these strategies, but today I'm going to show only results based on the introduction of voids and microcracks in the matrix. And basically there are 2 strategies to do that. The first one is to locally increase the edge spacing, and this was thought to be a good way to generate sharp interfaces, because it's well known that if you increase the edge spacing at some point, the melt pool will not overlap correctly anymore, and you will generate a defect, and these defects are organized as microcracks. And the idea here is really to introduce within the laser strategy some area with increasing locally the edge spacing, and what we are hoping to generate is some kind of interfaces that contains ligament connecting the matrix so that it's not completely disconnected, but at the same time it generates like small micro cracks locally. The other strategy on which we have been working is the opposite, trying to generate diffuse interface. So in this case we are trying to organize cavities close to each other to form an interface, but we are not trying to have something which is connected. And this can be done by actually using local laser parameters that in some cases will generate keyhole mode and the associated defect. And for the matrix we use the classical conduction mode so that we are able to locally organize porosity within the material. So the toughening mechanism that we hope to activate within these materials is a bit different depending on the type of interfaces that we will introduce in the material. In the case of a sharp interface made of microcracks, it's most likely going to introduce crack deflection and interlayers which can serve as crack arresters. But in the case of a diffuse interface, what we are hoping to see is also the inhomogeneity effect. So the inhomogeneity effect is based on the spatial variation of material properties in the direction of crack extension. And this is improving the toughness because the local variation is also introducing a spatial variation of the crack driving force, and this has been quite well studied by Koletnik and co-workers by modeling, and they have shown that this is a promising toughening mechanism. However, in many of the work which has been done on architecture's materials in metals, this was not easy to study because most of the time you would have like issues in architectures of metals happening at the interface. But in our case, since we are using a diffuse interface which contains porosities but no interface per se, we know we can hope to avoid any issues with like too massive crack deflection. So now I'm going to show you a few microstructural characterization for these two strategies and also the first mechanical results that we have on these specimens. So for the first strategy of sharp interfaces, we have been able to find a good compromise between hatch spacing too small to introduce defect, and you don't see any defect like here, or hatch spacing too large in such a way that it's not even a defect anymore, but cells which are not really connected to each other and would lead to very bad mechanical properties. And in some cases we were able to generate like interfaces that consist of ligament connecting the cells. However, these good structures has been produced only very recently. I'm not going to show you any more results on this strategy for today. For the second strategy, we have actually been able to generate quite well some architectures. In this case, for example, you are looking at squares cells of roughly 2 mm, which are quite dense. You see very limited porosities and organized, like separated by interfaces which contain a high density of porosities. So this was like a first attempt, and we also looked a little bit at the microstructures and so on, and you see that this is working quite well. So we have quantified the porosities within the interface and within the cell, and you can see that on average the material contains approximately 6% of porosity, but these are really concentrated within the interfaces, since there is like a factor 10 between the porosity within the cells and within the interfaces. So these are the first mechanical results that we have for these architectural materials. On the left, it's actually not architectural materials, but tensile tests printed with the parameters of the cell, so the dense material, or the parameter of the interface, so the porous materials. And you see that indeed there is a decrease of the Young modulus and the yield stress of the material because of the softening effect of the voids. And by using micro harness, we could also see that there is a roughly 100 HV drop in the hardness of the cell as compared to the hardness of the interface. So that means that that's quite in good agreement with the yield stress with the tensor test on the left, and that means that we successfully created a material that contains interfaces with a lower yield stress compared to the cells that have a higher yield stress. And now it's already time to jump to conclusion and future work. So in this study, the goal was to develop dense architecture metallic materials by controlling and engineering the defects. In this case, I focused on the results for the voids and micro cracks, which are associated to the LPDF process. And we have been able to generate diffuse interface with organized porosity within a matrix, and these interfaces had locally a decrease of the yield stress of the interlayer due to the softening effect of the void. And we hope that these architectures are expected to impart materials with high toughness and superior defect tolerance. And so the future work is now, we just have finished to print these samples in which we have introduced some laminar structures and some break-in mortars, etc. And we hope to see some significant effect on the mechanical behavior of these architectural materials. So I thank you very much for your attention, and don't hesitate to contact me if you have any questions. Thanks a lot.